Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second installment on the Capital Markets Union Action Plan. I see that some folks are still connecting, but we'll slowly get started with the introduction. So as you know, today we will be focusing on the review of the AIFMD directive, so commonly referred to as AIFMD2, and the proposed amendments to that directive that have been published quite recently. We'll try to really focus on the main topics therein. Luckily, they are a select few, so with the 45 minutes that are allocated to us today, we should be able to manage just fine. Just some very general housekeeping rules, very limited housekeeping rules. This is meant to be an interactive session. If you have questions, do not hesitate. We'll try to answer those to the best we can. You have two ways of communicating with us. You have on the bottom right the Q&A section, and you also have the chat section. So if you have technical questions on the content of what we are presenting, please use the Q&A button or Q&A panel. If you are encountering technical difficulties, please use the chat function. If you get those two confused, no problem. We'll try to get it sorted out, and we will take a look at both in parallel, but it may take us a little bit of time to react. In addition to you being able to raise questions during the presentation, we've also allocated a bit of time towards the end. So again, do not hesitate to reach out if anything is unclear, if you would like additional insights along the way. Just very briefly, presentation of who we are. So my name is Adrian Aldinger. I'm a partner in the investment management practice within Arendt, focusing on the formation of alternative funds, mainly private equity, private debt, and venture capital. And with me...
Yes, and my name is Daemgen. I'm a partner at Arendt Regulatory Consulting with the main focus on everything which is about AIFM, the AIFMD mainly. So supporting the setup of AIFMs and also the maintenance after being authorized.
So we'll be jumping back and forth between topics, and Michael and I will share those equally. With that being said, so with the introduction having been handled, we'd want to go straight into the heart of the matter. For those of you that have already participated in the previous session, you will be familiar with this slide. We thought nonetheless it would be useful just to throw this up again for those of you that haven't participated in the previous session, but also kind of to frame the discussion and the background behind these proposals. Because this proposal for the revised AIFMD obviously did not come out of nowhere. There were preparatory sessions, discussions, negotiations, speculations of what would go in there. And here you kind of can see the development of those discussions. I will not go into or discuss each and every point on the timeline. I would just mention one key date, which is December 2018, where there was a very fulsome report that was prepared by KPMG to identify any room for improvement or generally to assess how the AIFMD was operating and was functioning. I think the overall summary of that report was that it was generally fit for purpose. It was achieving the goals that had been intended. There were some minor points that were flagged where KPMG thought that there could be some room for improvement and some tweaks that could make sense. If you take a look at that list, it was actually a relatively long list, but as I said, each suggested change per se or on an isolated basis wasn't very significant. After that, there was actually a further reaction to the AIFMD and proposed changes, which had been issued by ESMA in a letter dated August 2020. So that isn't on the timeline, but is something that got the market's attention because it focused heavily on substance and delegation. There were other topics in there, but that was, I think, the topic where a lot of uncertainty was raised in terms of, how would existing operating models be implemented or maintained in the future. I think the good news so far, and we'll go into more detail in a minute, is that the proposals that were in that KPMG report and also in the ESMA letter have not been taken on board wholesale. There has been a selection of some of the points that have been put in the proposal, but not all of them. And again, we'll go into more details, but that is kind of the initial reaction that one had when observing the evolution of this proposal. So the proposal generally, and again, this will not be new to you if you've listened into last week's session. The proposal of the CMU covers different topics. So ESAP, AIFMD2, loan and debt funds, which is actually part of the AIFMD2 proposal on LTIF2, AIFMD and UCITS convergence, again, partly covered in the text that we will discuss today. Although we will not discuss this convergence points today because there will be a separate dedicated session just for that later in this series. And similarly, clarifications around the MiFID and MiFIR regime. Now, if we just look at the proposals contained in the AIFMD2 text, which are the points that we will cover today, they mainly focus on substance and delegation. Again, I think that is not a huge surprise. On reporting, which is a major point. Loan origination is probably the most, in pure textual change, is the greatest change that is being made to the AIFMD2. But again, we'll have a separate session just on loan funds next week. And then there are some additional complementary rules around depository, liquidity management, and third country rules, which we'll discuss today. So that is a bit to set the scene for today's presentation. And so without much further ado, I will hand it over to Michael to present the first topic on substance.
Thank you very much, Adrian. First of all, maybe a general remark before really going into the details here on substance. When the European Commission initiated the whole AIFMD topic in 2009, many market participants doubted that this will be a success. I remember a lot of discussions where people said, this will never ever achieve really the objectives or the objectives will never ever be achieved. And these objectives were at that time creating a single market, ensuring the stability of the financial sector, and protecting the investors. And now, almost one decade after the entry into force of the AIFMD in Luxembourg, or on a national level, I think it's fair to say that most of those objectives have been achieved. So we have a single market for alternative investment funds now. And the investor protection as well as the financial stability has been strengthened. So I think well done so far. And I just wanted to mention this, that you can keep this in mind when assessing afterwards the proposed changes and amendments. Because as Adrian already said, there are not that many. But maybe let's start really with the amendments on substance. Substance is very prominent today, also in our webinar. It's highlighted even in the title. However, when you look at the amendments proposed by the directive, which are linked to substance in a strict way, there are not that many. One is an amendment of Article 7, dealing with the information an initiator will have to provide the national authorities with when it comes to the to seeking for authorization. So in other words, once you say we would like to set up an AIFM, you need to provide specific information to the authorities, in our case, the CSSF. And here we have some details on what is necessary to be provided there. This information contains particularly a description of the appropriate human and technical resources, so the persons effectively conducting the business, the role, the title, reporting lines in and outside the AIFM, time allocated, etc. Then also information about the shareholding of the AIFM, a program of activity, information about the remuneration policies, and last but not least, the information on delegation and subdelegation. Moreover, in Article 8 will also be amended, and here it will be, or it is proposed to have a clear statement that at least two persons engaged are committed to decide the conduct of business on a full-time basis, which will need to be a resident in the European Union. So, two conducting officers acting on a full-time basis for the AIFM. For everyone who has recently filed an application file or dealt with the CSSF with regards to the substance of an AIFM, this sounds very familiar, I think. And actually, it is more or less in line what we know in Luxembourg. It is in line with the circular 18698, and it's also in line with the CSSF administrative practice. So it might be interesting not to point out what we have as amendments in the proposal, but what we don't see here. And I think there it's clear that we don't have any requirements with regards to minimum substance. We have nothing about secondments. So also in the future, if this goes through like that, we'll have the possibility to set up tailored structures fitting really for the specific purposes they're made for. Yeah, I think that's it. So as you see, not very much.
So Michael, just one question. If you had been the author of this proposed text, is there anything that you would have done differently on this point of substance? Is there anything you would suggest we consider amending if we could?
First of all, I obviously like it, as it is really in line with what we know in Luxembourg. Maybe one wish, you know, we have once more here a non-exhaustive list of requirements. It might have been nice to have an exhaustive one. This would have been, on one side, good for the initiators, knowing, okay, which kind of information do I need to collect, but also for the regulators, because then we would have a harmonized, clear approach all over Europe, and also they would know what they will have to ask for. But, you know, this is nothing else but the wish of a consultant in this context.
I hear you. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for that. Let me just see if we've received any questions so far. Yes, we have one. Is there a difference for a registered AIFM in Lux? So do the rules make the distinction between an authorized and a registered AIFM?
No, so far this proposal is only focusing on the authorized AIFMs. And registered AIFMs, by the way, also currently are not in full scope of the AIFMD, so only very, very limited, mainly the reporting requirements apply here. Good.
I think with that, maybe we'll move on to delegation, which is obviously a topic that is closely related to substance, because if you do delegation or you get delegation wrong, then obviously that risks your regulatory substance. And this was indeed a topic that we knew was going to be addressed in some form or another, because it had been a recurring theme through all of the discussions that came up prior to this proposal. I think the actual proposal, it's debatable to what extent it achieves this maintenance of minimum substance, but at least it has the merit of bringing additional clarifications. I think there are two main points I would highlight here. The first is that there is now I wouldn't say change, for me it's really a clarification that the delegation rules apply to all functions and ancillary services. And if you actually look at the changed language, it's very, very minimal to kind of clarify that distinction between functions as listed in Annex 1 and services as listed in Article 6, Paragraph 4. But it is the clear intention that all of these will now be caught by the strict delegation rules that most of you already know for portfolio and risk management. There's a further clarification that all of these rules should apply in the same fashion for subdelegation. Again, I think that is not a real surprise. But again, in certain instances, it may require you to reconsider your operating model. If we go back to this general rule that all the delegation rules apply irrespective of the nature of the function, that will mean that you'll have to justify this on objective reasons. You will need to show that the effective supervision by the regulator is not threatened. You'll have to have the technical and personnel in place and the expertise to demonstrate that you can actually ensure the proper discharge of these functions. So more a clarification than anything else, but in practice, there may be some circumstances where you will need to consider how this impacts your operation. I think another change that is potentially a little bit more fulsome or came a little bit more as a surprise is the delegation rules as they apply to third country entities, which will going forward be subject to increased reporting. So there is an annual notification that will have to be submitted by the national competent authorities to ESMA, providing details on delegated functions. To the extent, and this notification is only triggered if you delegate more portfolio or risk management than you retain. So that is the difficulty, I would say, with this wording, is that contrary to, for example, the letterbox definition that you have in the level 2 regulation, which clearly states that if the delegated functions exceed by substantial margin the functions you retain, there is more room to interpret what does more mean. As you will know, a very established model here in Luxembourg, but elsewhere as well, is that you will retain the entirety of risk management, but delegate the entirety of portfolio management, potentially to a third country entity. The question is, would that trigger this notification, or would anything else be required on top of that? So would, in addition to the entirety of the portfolio management, would you have to have some of the risk management also delegated? It's just not really clear from the current wording. So the question is, would it be beneficial maybe to have some kind of clarification on the quantitative or qualitative elements to take into consideration? For now, it's not clear, but just be warned that if you are delegating to an entity in a third country, there will be notifications that the local regulator, hence the CSF, will have to do to ESMA. And again, I think this is very much influenced by the whole Brexit experience, amongst others. So it's very hard to imagine that there will be a change to this prior to implementation. Because as a reminder, obviously now we're just talking about a draft, the first proposal, things may still change. I'll just stop or pause here for a second because I see that a number of questions have come in. Will the new delegation rules also apply for appointed sub-distributors? Yes, any delegation of functions or services, so the list is now fulsome, there is no exception anymore, applies to the delegation thereof, including any sub-delegation thereof.
Adrian, I have a question, if I may.
You may.
So listening to you, I ask myself, is there a potential impact, a structural impact on the Luxembourg delegation model coming with this?
Not for
Or is
now.
it?
I mean, for now, it's obviously, quote unquote, just intended as a notification obligation. The question is whether we're seeing kind of the beginning of a softening or revamping of the delegation rules, including increased supervisory powers of ESMA. I mean, I don't want to be paranoid. That's not where we are just yet, but you will see on the slide there's a 2-year peer review that is already scheduled and a 5-year letterbox review. I think that's when we'll see what these notifications, if they actually come, will have as a result. But it's too early to say. I think the immediate reaction is that it should not significantly disrupt your operations, but certainly a situation that needs to be monitored. One more question that I receive here is, would it make more sense to restrict risk and portfolio management delegation, or perhaps require the presence of capital raising roles, marketing roles within the AIFM if the commission is worried about letterbox AIFMs? Yes, I mean, that could certainly be an approach. Again, these notification requirements only relate to risk or portfolio management to third country entities. So it doesn't yet extend to the other services that we've seen just above for the other delegation rules. But it's very unclear, and unfortunately the recitals aren't very helpful in a lot of respects, in the sense that they don't provide a whole lot of information on a lot of these topics that we're presenting today, and some of it is just speculation. So we'll see what approach is retained at the end of the day. But it's a first start, and I think one that the industry can generally live with.
Yep.
One further question before I hand it over to Michael for the next slot is whether there is an intention that these requirements will be replicated to UCITS. I would refer you to the separate session we'll have on AIFMD and UCITS convergence, but the general answer to this is yes, there is an increased desire to create a harmonized framework. And delegation would certainly, in the long run, be one of those topics that would be covered in that sense. So, if there are no further questions at this point, I would then hand it over to Michael for the next topic and the next slide.
Yeah, let's spend some minutes on the scope of activities. The proposal amends also these topics by adding new activities, new functions. But before really going here into the details, maybe we should step back a little bit and talk 1 minute about the different functions an AIFM can have. So in principle, we have 2 different types. One are the functions described in Annex 1 of the AIFMD, being the functions a AIFM can provide in the context of the collective investment management, being the management of an AIF. And here we currently have the core functions being portfolio management and risk management, the administration and the marketing, and moreover asset-related activities. On the other hand, we have the functions you can provide in the context of an extended license, so the so-called ancillary services. There we have currently the discretionary portfolio management, we have the investment advice, the reception transmission of orders with regards to financial instruments, and also the safekeeping and administration of shares or units of collective investment undertakings. And by the way, these ancillary services and the extended license is often called the MiFID top-up, which is not 100% correct, and you'll see it later on. But let's remain here for a minute. So we have the standard license, defined in the Annex 1, and we have the additional ancillary services for which you would need to have an extended license. With regards to the Annex 1 activities, the proposal adds 2 new services, being the origination of loans on one side, which makes a lot of sense due to the fact that a main topic of the whole proposal is the loan originating funds. And as this is a manager's directive, it must be also linked, in this case, to the AIFM. That's one part. And then on the other, we have also a new function being the servicing of securitization special purpose entities. The reason for that is also kind of simple. As you might know, securitization special purpose entities are by definition excluded from the AIFMD. They're not AIF by definition. And in the past, it was always kind of an issue how to structure an AIFM that this entity is also in a position to support, to service securitization vehicles. And with this amendment, we'll have a clarification on that. That's one thing. Then with regards to the ancillary services, also here, two additional type of services. We have the new service of being the administration of benchmarks on one side, and another one, credit servicing. Moreover, the proposal itself, so in the text of the law or the directive, is stated that the MiFID rules, which usually so far apply to ancillary services, and that's why it's called often the MiFID top-up, will not apply in case of these new ancillary services, so administration of benchmarks and credit servicing. Moreover, in the whereas of this proposal, you find also an interesting statement being that the MiFID rules will also not apply to AIFM providing ancillary services involving financial instruments. In other words, this whereas at least clarifies that if you provide ancillary services or perform ancillary services with regard to non-financial instruments, for example, providing investment advice on real estate, then in principle the MiFID rules should not apply. This was not that clear before, even if it became more and more administrative practice also here in Luxembourg. Yeah, so maybe a word on how this is being seen by the market or the industry. So in principle, it's welcomed. You know, it's always good to have more possibilities, to have more clearly defined services, and to have also a legal security that you know which law applies in which case. To be honest, well, the future will show if these additional ancillary services will be really of use or not. You could also question the type of services included here. Why is administration of benchmarks in and not, for example, the execution of orders? But in principle, once more, I think this is good news.
Thanks, Michael.
So yeah, the liquidity management with you, Adrian.
Thanks so much. Just always keeping an eye on the Q&A tab, but no further questions at this stage. So we'll jump into liquidity management, specifically liquidity management tools. So the Commission has included this concept of liquidity management tools that should be employed for open-ended AIFs or AIFMs managing open-ended AIFs. There's a new Annex 5 that is contemplated that lists all of these different liquidity management tools. So they go from suspensions of redemptions and subscriptions, redemption gates, notice periods, redemption fees, swing pricing, anti-dilution levies, redemptions in kind, and side pockets. That is the exhaustive list you will find in this new Annex 5. And each of them is actually defined in Annex 5. So a bit of a counterintuitive approach, not the definitions, the existing definitions section of the directive, but actually defined in the annex itself where these are used. So it is stated that for open-ended AIFs, the managers of the AIFM will have to think about which liquidity management tools should be employed and craft policies and procedures around their use, and specifically for the activation and deactivation. The provisions aren't very granular in terms of how those policies and procedures should be determined. Obviously, we'll need to take into consideration the specificities of the actual product. But you need to choose at least one of the LMTs in addition to the suspension of redemptions and subscriptions. I think in practice, you'll want a mix, or you'll have a mix that allows you to adequately cater for the needs that you encounter in practice. So, to what extent this is a real constraint compared to what a lot of sponsors we see in the market already doing, that I think is a question. Another change, in addition to having these policies and procedures for activation and deactivation, is that the competent authorities, so in our case, the CSF, would have to be notified when an activation or deactivation has been triggered. The exact timeline, when that has to be done, the form, etc., all of that is still not clear. So it's just a principle that is stated for now. And a further potentially more significant change is that the ESMA has actually, or it is contemplated that the ESMA will receive additional powers here to activate or require the AIFMs to activate or deactivate liquidity management tools. That sounds relatively intrusive, and I think it can be. The question is, in certain strategies, how do you deal with very regular and frequent notifications that could have to be done because of a very frequent activation of these tools? So I think there are a lot of practical questions around this topic that haven't been fully settled, where we will just have to wait for further guidance. Just mindful of time, I think I'll already hand it over to Michael for the next topic, because again, this is actually one topic where I think we all are expecting a little bit more clarity. Before I do, however, hand it over to Michael, I see that we do have one question, and it says, do we expect that the ESMA will require AIFMs to activate, deactivate LMTs for prudential purposes whenever ESMA deems it necessary? Well, that's a good question, and unfortunately, I don't think we know just yet. I think our hope would certainly be that these powers that have or will be granted to ESMA will be used, sparingly, so only in circumstances where it considers that the AIFM or the governing body is not reacting quickly enough or adequately enough. But I would really hope and expect this to be a tool or weapon of last resort. But again, we'll have to stay tuned. So that I'll hand it back over to Michael for the disclosure and reporting obligations.
Reporting requirements, to be honest, this is kind of a little bit a boring topic as always, but it is an important topic, particularly because it means collection of new data, it means potentially extra costs, and so on. So also here, a quick one on this. In principle, we have two types of disclosures / reporting, which are proposed to be amended. On one side, we have the disclosures to investors, and on the other side, we have the Annex 4 reporting to the competent authorities. Let's maybe start with the disclosures to investors. So the European Commission proposes to amend Article 23 in this respect, and to amend here particularly paragraphs 1 and 4. And this should include additional disclosures for funds of the open-end type, their information on the possibility and the conditions for using liquid management tools, so what we have just discussed before. And then also a list of fees and charges that will be applied in connection with the operations of the AIF, borne by the AIFM and its affiliates. So the charges and fees which are then on the level of the AIFM or its affiliates. Moreover, we have also more frequent ongoing disclosure, and there are new requirements. On one side, the loan portfolios originated by AIFs, if any, and then on a quarterly basis, all direct and indirect fees and charges that were directly or indirectly charged or allocated to the AIF or to its investments. That's one. And then another quarterly reporting with regards to any parent company, subsidiary, or special purpose entity established in relation to the AIF's investments. So this is new with regards to the investor disclosure. Obviously, it is discussed. It is discussed, particularly the necessity and the add value of these new requirements. Let's just talk about the frequency of a quarterly reporting with regards to fees and charges. This might make a lot of sense when talking about a fund of the open-ended type. However, is it really that important in case of a fund of the closed-end type? I don't know. Moreover, the precise list of disclosures. I think we should keep in mind that we're mainly talking about professional investors when talking about AIF investors. So they usually know what they want, and all these type of information are usually also agreed on a contractual basis between the initiator and the manager and the investor. But once more, this is currently being discussed, and I think it's fair to say that more and more harmonized information does not mean necessarily a better information, more appropriate information. I think that's it more or less when it comes here to the disclosure to investors. Maybe also a word on the amendments to Annex 4 reporting. So far, the AIFMD requires to report to its competent authorities, and now the wording of the directive, the current one, the principal markets and instruments in which it trades, the main instruments it is trading in, the principal exposures, most important concentration for each of the AIF it manages, and the main categories of assets in which the AIF invests. The relevant words here, they are deleted in the new proposal, which means that it will be necessary to report in relation to all markets, all instruments, and all exposures. And in order to put this in place, ESMA is to publish new regulatory technical standards, a new template for this Annex 4 reporting. I think also here, obviously, the first reaction of the market was we already provide a lot of information to the authorities, really a significant volume of information. So it should at least be allowed to ask what kind of lack do we have that it's necessary to put on top additional information and reporting requirements, particularly because they will lead obviously also to new costs. And some even asked, wouldn't it be even better to think about to clarify the interpretation of certain data fields in the existing framework than going one step forward and asking for even more information. Okay, that's it on disclosures. I think, Adrian, the next one is yours again, right?
Indeed, thanks, Michael. And this will actually be a relatively brief one. It's on the depository rules, which haven't changed significantly or haven't changed at all. And let me explain that sentence, which seems a bit counterintuitive. If it hasn't changed, why am I reporting something? Well, the initial discussions pre-proposal were around a potential depository passport. So that is not what is proposed here. Far from it, actually, but it is a recognition of the fact that there may be some benefit of loosening the rules around having the depository established in the jurisdiction of the AIF. Due to certain market inefficiencies or different levels of service that can be provided in different member states, the Commission thinks that it can make sense to think about opening the regimes to allowing an AIF or an AIFM to appoint a depository that is located in another member state other than the AIF. That is a clear goal stated in the recitals, but there is no corresponding change in Article 21. That is, again, a bit disturbing because we don't know whether the idea was just kind of to flag the idea and see what reactions come back, or whether there will be a further change to the actual depository rules later. It's not very clear, although the recital itself is quite clear. So we'll have to stay tuned to see how that plays out, but there seems to be a general willingness to expand the scope of potential depositories. There are also some clarifications on third country rules, which I'll leave to Michael to discuss in the next segment. And then finally, a very small clarification around the use of CSDs. So there is a delegation that is possible to these, and that does not require a further due diligence to be made on such entities. And that is the update, I think, more than anything else on depositories. So really no fundamental shift in current position on this specific topic. And we did, however, want to mention it because it obviously counts towards organizational requirements in the largest sense that an AIFM will have to think about when being appointed as such for an AIF. So unless there are questions, which I do not see here, I will hand it over back to Michael for the last topic, which is third country rules.
So third country rules, also a minor amendment here. Particularly when it comes to the distribution via the national private placement regimes, as you all know, we have two ways of distributing within the AIFMD. One is via the European passport. However, this is only accessible, so far at least, to European alternative investment fund managers managing European alternative investment funds, and for all the rest, so non-European alternative investment fund managers managing AIFs, or non-European AIFs being managed by European alternative investment fund managers. For all those entities, the national private placement rules are the only possibility to market their funds. And here, the AIFMD1 already set some specific conditions for those NPPRs, and one of which was that the domicile of the non-European AIFM or the non-European AIF should not be considered by the Financial Action Task Force, so FATF, as a non-cooperative country or territory, so being on the blacklist of the FATF. And this is being replaced by the new reference to the high risk jurisdiction pursuant to the European AML directive, which makes to a certain extent sense to keep it within the European framework. That one change, and another would be another proposed amendment is an additional requirement that the domicile of the non-European AIFM or the non-European AIF must not be on the EU list of non-cooperative tax jurisdictions. Particularly with regards to this last condition, we see some discussions and potential risks which might pop up. Just imagine, you are already marketing with on the NPPR in a specific country, and then this EU tax list would be changed, including also this country. So marketing would not be possible anymore. So there is, and this would be partly true when talking about funds of the closed-end type, where marketing usually takes much longer than in case of open-end funds. Hence, there is a risk of a potential legal uncertainty here, and a solution could be a grandfathering clause, in a way stating, for example, okay, if you started marketing in this jurisdiction and something will happen with regards to the EU tax list, then you will have, I don't know, a couple of more weeks, days, whatever, to finalize this, at least to have a clear understanding of how and what can be done in this context. So this in a nutshell, Adrian?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, we're up on time, but I think we can keep the preliminary findings relatively short. So I think if we had to summarize the changes, I would say that this is really more an evolution than a revolution. There are some changes we'll need to consider how exactly they impact some operating models, but in total, it's not as disruptive for the industry as one might have expected. That being said, I would keep in mind that ESMA is generally receiving additional powers, for now more data collection powers rather than anything else, but still maybe a first step to increase supervisory powers. And I would also remind everyone that this is just a first proposal. So we're not at the end of the legislative process just yet. We need to see what reactions come out of the market and the participants and stakeholders, and see where this ultimately ends up.
Yeah, and this leads me to the next steps. The Commission proposed that's what they have to do. Now it's up to the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union to discuss and to find a political agreement. This is expected to be reached mid-end of this year. So under the French presidency or the next one, the Czech presidency. And if this is the case, we might see a potential publication in the official journal of the European Union early next year. And then we would have a 24-month implementation timeline, which means that we could have this live early 25. If everything goes in the right direction. And yeah.
So stay tuned is the message at this point. I don't know if there are any questions. I don't see any on the list, but obviously, if you do have any further questions after this presentation, you have our contact details here. Feel free to reach out. So we're happy to take any questions after this presentation as well. And here, without going through it, just as a reminder, the upcoming sessions within this series that you may be interested in. So with that, I would thank you all for your time and your participation. I hope that we didn't make you lose your appetite and that you can now jump into your well-deserved lunch break if you haven't been able to do so while listening to this. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.